Forward to second edition. This book sets out to criticize one branch of contemporary philosophy from the point of view of Marxism. At the same time, its aim is to discuss what can be learned from this philosophy. The Marxist standpoint, which I try to maintain against all comers, is not a stationary one, since Marxist ideas must always be developing and be formulated for our own times and problems. That is why as much as a third of this book deals with Marxism itself, and discusses socialist humanism, Marxist views on ethics, the significance of the present-day scientific and technological revolution, and materialist dialectics. I have been criticized for putting all this in about Marxism, as irrelevant to the critical purpose of the book, but it was essential to my purpose, for I do not think one should separate criticism of other views from development of one's own. There was once an idea among Marxists, which I shared, that there is an impassable gulf between us and DM. This is only a part truth. One would not propose to water down Marxism by adopting ideas opposed to it, but that is no reason to condemn everything that is not Marxist as wholly reactionary and false. If something is false, one must prove that it is false. That it is not Marxist does not constitute such a proof. An honest criticism of ideas one does not accept often shows that they are neither so reactionary nor so false as might have been originally suggested. In reviewing contemporary ideas, there are factors to take into account. One is the growing influence of a scientific approach, not only in natural science, but in social and philosophical studies. Another is that individual thinkers of any originality are intelligent, well-educated and sincere. They see much wrong with the status quo and are seeking how to change it. So that to impute reactionary motivations to their work is often to mistake them greedy. These are all reasons why I finished this book with some observations about coexistence and controversy. One must not compromise in ideas, but one must discuss, understand and learn. As for the contemporary philosophy which is discussed and criticized in this book, Wittgenstein once said, "Philosophy is not a theory but an activity." I wanted to try to understand better the sort of activity now being done in the philosophy departments of British and some American universities, the so-called linguistic philosophy. The name is in one respect misleading, for there exists no set doctrine or theory of linguistic philosophy. As I have said in the course of this book, it is not so much a theory as a method of discussing and criticizing theories. It is distinguished from other methods of discussion in philosophy by its concern with questions about uses of language. For linguistic philosophy, every philosophical problem concerns the use of words, and is therefore to be solved by the method of inquiring into the uses of words. This is the activity Wittgenstein recommended to philosophers. Contrariwise, problems which cannot be reduced to questions about words are not philosophical problems at all, but some other sort of problem. In this, the linguistic philosophy emerges as the very antithesis of any philosophy, like Marxism, which seeks to find a perspective and purpose for human life by an inquiry into the foundations of human thought and action. It makes no such inquiry, but says it cannot be made. In this way, it is representative of some very pervasive features of our day and age, namely, loss of perspective, lack of confidence in mankind and its future, skepticism as to the possibility of finding out any reasons why, disengagement from the big issues of human progress and, instead, narrow specialist concern with technical questions. In order to try to understand this philosophy as a contemporary phenomenon, to critic it and at the same time try to find what can be got out of it, I thought it best to study its background. Hence the long historical introduction to this book. In this, I also wanted to correct some of what I had previously written about the same subject in my book Science versus Idealism. I have tried to show how the empiricist precursors of the contemporary philosophy created for themselves a series of problems and difficulties, and evolved by trying to find ways of getting around them. And I have tried to show, too, how these problems were not merely adventitious, but came up out of the problems of the development of social life. In this connection, it was especially important to consider the development of logic, and to try to disentangle the proper questions of formal logic, as a scientific discipline, from philosophical theories about them. Russell's Principia Mathematica was an immense contribution to science, but in it there was mixed up, to its detriment, some very dubious philosophical theory. This disentangling is important, not only because of the key role of discussion of logical problems in contemporary philosophy, but because Marxists need to rid ourselves once for all of the idea that materialist dialectics is in any way contradictory to, or supplants, formal logic. Another important consideration is that modern philosophy has been concerned more and more with questions of the interpretation of the sciences. In this connection, I have tried to point out the significance of subjective idealism as a philosophical theory growing out of discussion about the sciences. But at the same time, I have pointed out that, ever since George Berkeley, philosophers have been preoccupied with the criticism of subjective idealism. In contemporary philosophy, it is more or less defunct. And so far from being a form of subjective idealism, the contemporary linguistic philosophy has contributed some of the most telling criticisms. In the criticism of contemporary philosophy, what seems to me of key importance is not so much criticism of subjective idealism, as of the contrast and divergence, which still holds between natural and social sciences. The former study processes and relations within them which lie hidden behind appearances. But the latter, as Marx said long ago when he criticized bourgeois economics, deal only with appearances. They deal with how capitalism lures to the trader, industrialist or businessman, but not with the processes of exploitation of labor on which it is based, nor with the social contradictions which presage its end. The thought I have tried to express in this book is that the most crucial thing in modern empiricist bourgeois philosophy has been the working out of a view of science, of scientific knowledge and the functions of science, which squares with and justifies the actual character of bourgeois social science and more especially economics. This question of what it is to study not only appearances but the underlying reality, in its real development, is the main question about which Marxists have to argue. The relation of appearance to reality is a very basic philosophy problem for Marxism. In criticism of the linguistic philosophy, I have entered into some discussion about the subject matter of philosophy, but without attempting to argue about any formal definition. It seems to me that to define philosophy is to define the problems of philosophy, and these change with the times. As to the problems of philosophy today, it seems to me that the linguistic philosophers go wrong by taking an extremely narrow and restricted view. But on one matter I agree with them, namely, that problems of philosophy must be distinguished from problems of empirical science, and consist of problems remaining to be solved by other methods, if such methods can be found. I agree with them that philosophy, as compared with the sciences, does not deal with what is the case, which we have to find out by empirical investigation, but with questions about how to interpret what we find, how do we know, what is the methodology, and also with questions about the meaning of life, purpose, values and the like. A basic thought of Wittgenstein, and in linguistic philosophy, is that in such discussions a lot of nonsense is talked. And with this, too, one can hardly disagree. They want to clear away this nonsense, and for that purpose ask how it arises. Wittgenstein was responsible for the suggestion that it happens because people ask badly formulated questions, or pseudo-questions, and so we get pseudo-theories as the answers. This is what led to posing the investigation of uses of language as of basic importance in philosophy. We play various language games, said Wittgenstein. Nonsense results from getting them mixed up. If then we are puzzled by some philosophical ch1, we should ask, how is language being used here? If we can pin down and clarify the uses of language, philosophical puzzles vanish. This book contains a lot of detailed criticism of the writings of several linguistic philosophers, where it seems to me they have made false assumptions or reached unjustified conclusions in their general observations about language and its uses. I recommend these criticisms to anyone who is either puzzled by these writings or, on the other hand, inclined to accept them as contemporary gospel. But at the same time, I would like to emphasize, and have emphasized in the text, that whatever criticisms may be made of this or that book or article by this or that linguistic philosopher, or of the overall point of view that results, the linguistic approach can be fruitful. Indeed, linguistic analysis is an indispensable tool for philosophical discussion, even though not by itself the only thing needed. In particular, I have tried to show that there is much to be learned from the work of Gilbert Ryle. His concept of mind has been attacked by some of his colleagues, but it is a materialist book and a useful book for Marxists, and possibly that is one reason why it has been criticized so much by people who are also opponents of materialism and Marxism. Ryle introduced the conception of what he called category mistakes as the typical errors made in philosophy. This idea is a profound and fruitful one. He used it to criticize traditional conceptions about body and mind. He showed that to say the mind exists independent of the body is the same sort of absurdity as we find in Alice in Wonderland when the Cheshire Cat's smile exists independently of the Cheshire Cat. It is a category mistake in as much as it puts mind in the same category as body, as though a mind were a ghosty body attached to the physical one. But minds and smiles are not thus related to bodies and cats. I have taken up this idea of category mistake, and of studying the logic of categories, and try to show its materialist and dialectical content which Ryle himself does not at all realize. In this connection I have also discussed some problems of the methods and subject matter of logic. I have also devoted some attention to the work of the late J.L. Austin, not only in the criticism of subjective idealism, but in the study of ways in which words are used for purposes other than making statements of fact. Very suggestive, in my opinion, is Austin's book Doing Things with Words, in which he deals with what he called the performative use of language. The basic point is quite simple. To say I will when getting married, for example, is not simply a statement recording one's mental condition at the time. It is an act, a pledge. With those words one does not merely state a fact, but one performs an action, namely, one gets married. And without this sort of verbal performance there would be no marriage as a human institution. We do things with words, and I think it important to try to follow up Austin's analysis by seeing how this use of language enters into more or less the whole of human social activity. Thus, I have suggested that such a basic human institution as property could not be established without the use of language, and similarly with all, or nearly all, human relations. Marx and Engels maintain that the use of language is a product of social production. This is the materialist account of it, and language as a product of social production is needed for carrying on not only production but every form of human activity, human institution and human relation of which social production forms the basis. This leads finally to considering the special use of language in what are called value judgments. Some linguistic philosophers, and notably R.M. Hare, have contributed interesting studies on this, in which, in my opinion, they have got quite a few bourgeois prejudices mixed up with their analysis. It seems to me that the distinction which these studies make between value judgments, on the one hand, and factual judgments, on the other, is of importance in the discussion of problems of ethics, and I have accordingly applied it in the last part of this book, in the discussion of Marxist views about ethics. My main point is that we can find as good reasons for value judgments as for factual judgments. For example, as good reasons for saying that socialism is a better form of society than capitalism, as for saying that Everest is a higher mountain than Ben Nevis. But to argue the case we must distinguish the objective criteria of moral argument from those of factual argument. To conclude, I am well aware that some of the propositions I have advanced in this book may not be very readily acceptable to many of my fellow Marxists. For one thing, some of them are new, and whatever is new raises queries and needs to be scrutinized carefully. For another, some go contrary to traditionally accepted interpretations of Marxism. I do not believe for a moment that all I have put forward on these questions is yet correctly formulated in this book. A lot more work needs to be done. I think, however, that this discussion can contribute to the creative development of Marxist theory in its application to contemporary problems. The only changes made in the new edition of this book are that some misprints have been corrected, and the original foreword is replaced by this new one. It is based on some remarks I made at a discussion on the book organized last year by the Cultural Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain, MC, London, June, 1967, acknowledgements in discussing and criticizing in this book the views of various philosophers, and the views about philosophy of various authors. I have aimed, on the most important points, to quote their own words. I do not think quotation for this purpose requires the formal permission of contemporary authors or their publishers, but I would like to take the opportunity of expressing the appreciation and gratitude which I feel, along, I presume, with everyone else interested in discussing philosophy, to these authors and their publishers for writing, editing and publishing works so well worth discussing. In dealing with contemporary philosophy, I have referred only to those works which are easily available in volume form, and have not delved further into the very copious literature of articles and discussion contributions available only in the journals. Of great value here are three 3 recently published volumes in which articles are collected together, Logical Positivism, edited by A.J. Ayer, and the 2 volumes Logic and Language, edited by A.G.N. Flew. As the world knows, these editors are very well equipped to select the most important and most interesting articles. The following is the list of works quoted in this book. In the case of works first published in this century, I have also noted their publishers: J.L. Austin, How to Do Things with Words, Oxford University Press; Philosophical Papers, A Plea for Excuses, Other Minds, Oxford University Press; A.J. Ayer, Language, Truth and Logic, Gollins, Philosophical Essays, On the Analysis of Moral Judgments, Macmillan, The Concept of a Person and Other Essays, Philosophy and Language, Macmillan, edited by A.J. Ayer; Logical Positivism, Sociology and Physicalism by O. von Neurath; Positivism and Realism in the Turning Point Philosophy by Moritz Schlick, Allen and Unwin; Francis Bacon, Novum Organum; Sir Leon Bagrat, The Age of Automation, Weidenfeld and Nicholson; George Berkeley, A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge; The Analyst, Rudolf Carnap, The Logical Syntax of Language; Kegan Paul, The Unity of Science, Psyche Miniatures, Introduction to Semantics, Chicago University; Friedrich Engels, Speech at Marx's Graveside; Ludwig Feuerhatch, Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Anti-Dring, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, The Dialectics of Nature, see also Marx, edited by A.G.N. Flew; Logic and Language, Torvalds, Introductions by A.G.N. Flew, Categories and Systematically Misleading Expressions by G. Ryle, The Language of Political Theory by Margaret MacDonald, Blackwell; Ernest Gellner, Words and Things, Gollins; R.M. Hare, The Language of Morals, Oxford University Press; Freedom and Reason, Oxford University Press; Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, Human Nature, E.J. Hobsbawm, Introduction to Marx's Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations, Lawrence and Wishart; David Hume, Treatise of Human Nature, Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, Essays; William and Martha Neal, The Development of Logic, Oxford University Press; V. I. Lenin, The Tasks of the Youth League's Lawrence and Wishart, included in Lenin's Selected Worlds; John Locke, Essay Concerning the Human Understanding, Essay Concerning Civil Government; Ernst Mach, The Analysis of Sensations, Karl Marx, Capital, Volumes 1 and 3, Theories of Surplus Value, Theses on Feuerbach, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Critique of Political Economy, Economic and Philosophy Cal Manuscripts of 1844, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law, Critique of the Gotha Program, and with F. Engels, The Holy Family, The German Ideology, The Communist Manifesto, Correspondence, G. E. Moore, Principia Ethica, Cambridge University Press, A Defense of Common Sense, in Contemporary British Philosophy, 2nd Series, Allen and Unwin; William Morris, Communism; P. H. Noel Smith, Ethics, Penguin; K. R. Popper, The Logic of Scientific Discovery; Hutchinson, The Poverty of Historicism, Routledge, Conjectures and Refutations, Routledge; Bertrand Russell, Our Knowledge of the External World, Allen and Unwin; Mysticism and Logic, W. W. Norton, History of Western Philosophy, Allen and Unwin; My Philosophical Development, Allen and Unwin; Gilbert Ryle, The Concept of Mind, Hutchinson; Dilemmas, Cambridge University Press; Philosophical Arguments, Oxford University Press; Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations; Alfred Tarski, Logic, Semantics, Metamathematics, The Concept of Truth and Formalized Languages, Oxford University Press; F. M. Voltaire, Philosophical Dictionary; Ludwig Wittgenstein, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus; Kegan Paul, Philosophical Investigations, Blackwell. I would like also to acknowledge a special debt to 2 works by Professor Adam Schaff, of Warsaw, recently translated into English: A Philosophy of Man, Lawrence and Wishart; An Introduction to Semantics, Pergamon Press; to Dr. John Lewis, whose Life and Teaching of Karl Marx, Lawrence and Wishart, I was able to read before its publication, and to the research workers of the Institute of Philosophy of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, with whom I was able to discuss, a few years ago, some points about both the peculiarities of contemporary bourgeois philosophy and the logical character of the laws of dialectics. But in making this last acknowledgement, I hasten to absolve them from complicity in such errors or misconceptions as may be found in the following pages. Empiricism and Logic. Chapter 1, Principles for Science and Principles for Government. 1. Man, the interpreter of nature. Man, as the minister and interpreter of nature, does and understands as much as his observations on the order of nature, with regard to things or the mind, permit him, and neither knows nor is capable of more. In this first aphorism of the Novum Organum, Francis Bacon stated a principle which has given the direction to the mainstream of British philosophy ever since. Bacon's main contention was the old one, that all knowledge is furnished through the senses, but he carried it to radical conclusions. Because we can know nothing except what we can learn through our senses, it follows that we can form no ideas that are not derived in one way or another from experience, and theories which cannot be experientially verified are worthless. This was to set up the scientific view of nature as against the previous philosophy. It expressed the revolt against the categories, or rather, the category mistakes, of feudal thought, first causes, substantial forms and the like, which stood in the way of understanding the real causes and laws of motion of natural phenomena. Thus, for instance, Thomas Aquinas, who was a traditionally recognized philosophical authority, would agree that knowledge begins from observation, and that the senses provide the data for the system of human knowledge. But for him, that system had to be constructed on the basis of principles laid down by authorities recognized by a church, leading to orthodox theological conclusions. And by arguing from empirical data to first causes, he constructed a body of theoretical propositions which could not possibly be submitted to any test of experience. If science was ever to flourish, this traditional philosophy had to be destroyed. Bacon's doctrine sought to replace dogmatic theology and speculation about God and nature by scientific investigation of nature. It did not formulate any all-embracing system, but called for the experimental investigation of natural processes, whether these concerned things or the mind. Moreover, Bacon maintained that this experimental investigation of the order of nature was not required merely to find things out and satisfy human curiosity. Knowledge and human power are synonymous, he wrote, since the ignorance of the cause frustrates the effect. For nature is only subdued by submission, and that which in contemplative philosophy corresponds with the cause in practical science becomes the rule ch1 of Organum 1, 3. By submitting ourselves to nature, that is to say, by finding out how things really are by observation and experiment, instead of vainly trying to work out a priori how things must be, we can subdue and master nature, and the discovery of real causes is the discovery of the practical rule of how to produce the effect. 2. Discourse on Method. 17 years after the publication of An Novum Organum, there appeared René Descartes' Discourse on Method, which marked out another starting point. Bacon was not a man of science, but a politician who had the imagination to see what experimental science might yet do and achieve. Descartes, on the other hand, was a working scientist, a great mathematician, but he had less imagination. These two works, which together may be said to have laid the foundation of all subsequent scientific philosophy, were contradictory but yet significantly alike. Both proceeded from the conviction that the old feudal philosophy was futile, its categories had no application, and its proofs proved nothing, and worse than futile, a positive hindrance to any progress of knowledge. And both proceeded to state a method for the discovery of demonstrable truth. Descartes' method has been called the method of universal doubt, but that is an incomplete description of it. It is rather the method of clear and distinct ideas. According to Descartes, clear and distinct ideas are true. His pattern for clearness and distinctness was derived from geometry. He was himself the discoverer of coordinate geometry, and his contention was that when analysis and definition are made sufficiently rigorous, the resulting propositions are always demonstrable, in just the same way as in geometry. In pursuit of demonstrations in philosophy, he took the course of doubting everything except that which was dearly indubitable, and this he found in the proposition cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I exist. For, he argued, to doubt is to think, and, if there is thinking, a thinking being must exist. From this, as he thought, indubitable existential premise, he then proceeded in a geometrical manner to demonstrate the general order of the universe. First, from the mere postulate of existence it followed that God, an uncreated and infinitely perfect being, exists. Therefore God must have created us, and as a perfect being could not intend to deceive. He must also have created the material objects of which he has caused us to have perceptions. Material and mental substances are distinct and independent creations, Descartes maintained. We know that they are independent because we have a clear idea of the essence of each. Material substance is essentially extended, and mental substance is essentially perceiving and thinking, and as these ideas are distinct, so must the substances themselves be distinct. Descartes' universal doubt cast doubt on the existence of everything except the thinking self, on the existence of bodies, and the existence of other minds. Thus he first raised the question which has harried philosophers ever since, of how we know that anything exists beyond our own awareness. His own answer has long since been abandoned, for it contains a good many very clear and distinct non sequiturs, but the question has remained. In one way, Descartes went much further than Bacon in his skeptical questioning of ideas previously taken as unquestionable. Bacon never had a doubt that the use of the senses yielded knowledge of material reality, independent of the mind, and there to be explored by the investigator. Descartes squarely rejected this assumption, until it could be proved as rigorously as theorems in geometry were proved. But in another and, indeed, far more revolutionary way, Bacon went much further than Descartes. For Bacon maintained that the methods of the natural sciences were the only methods of obtaining knowledge of the real world, and that on the basis of natural science a sufficiently complete picture of the world, of nature and society, could be built up as to require no supplementation by any philosophy standing above the sciences. Descartes, on the other hand, considered that the sciences themselves must have as their foundation a philosophy independent of the sciences, worked out by a priori reasoning from first principles evident to the mind. Bacon had little to say about mathematics, but his view implied that mathematical reasoning was essentially a tool of the sciences. Descartes, on the other hand, considered that such reasoning was autonomous and was the way to systematic knowledge of final or ultimate truth independent of the natural sciences, by reference to which any and all conclusions of the sciences must be interpreted and judged. 3. Body and sense. While Descartes was deducing God in the coexistence of distinct material and mental substances, Bacon's certainty that observation and experiment yielded knowledge of material reality, and that this was the one and only road to knowledge, led his pupil, Thomas Hobbes, to the only consistent conclusion, that all knowledge is knowledge of the material world, and that to assert the existence of anything other than the material world, transcending it, creating it or acting on it, was to engage in fantasy. Hobbes took as his starting point Bacon's principle that all knowledge is furnished through the senses, but he did not follow this up by further expounding the principles of scientific method and leaving it to the future development of science to elaborate the theory of the constitution of the universe and the nature of man. Rather, he followed it up by deducing straight away a materialist metaphysics which stated of what the real world consisted. As his successors in materialism, Marx and Engels, afterwards commented, in Bacon, its first creator, modern materialism contained latent and still in a naive way the germs of all-round development. In its further development, materialism became one-sided. Hobbes was the one who turned Bacon's materialism into a system, tf Holy Family, 6, 3, d. According to Hobbes, that which really exists, and which appears to us through our senses as clothed in the appearance of sensible qualities, is matter, or body. Nothing else exists. The world consists of bodies, which are always in motion. What we call mind is only a specific motion of bodies, and he reached this conclusion by considering how the thoughts of man originate. Concerning the thoughts of man, he wrote, "The original of them all is that which we call sense, for there is no conception in a man's mind which hath not at first, totally or by parts, been begotten upon the organs of sense. The rest are derived from that original. The cause of sense," he continued, "is the external body, or object, which presseth the organ proper to each sense, either immediately, as in the taste and touch, or mediately, as in hearing, seeing and smelling. Leviathan, I. The action of external objects upon the sense organs produces in the mind what Hobbes variously called seemings or apparitions or fancies, the sensations of light, color, sound, odor, hardness, softness, etc., all which qualities called sensible are in the object that causeth them, but so many several motions of the matter by which it presseth our organs diversely. Neither in us that are pressed are they anything else but diverse motions, for motion produceth nothing but motion, but their appearance to us is fancy, the same waking as dreaming. Thus, whatsoever accidents or qualities our senses make us think there be in the world, they be not there, but are seeming in apparitions only. The things that really are in the world without us are those motions by which these seemings are caused. Hobbes defined body, or matter, by the property of existing objectively in space, external to and independent of our consciousness of it. Our consciousness was for him only an appearance or apparition arising from the interactions of other bodies with human bodies. The word body, he wrote, signifieth that which filleth or occupied some certain room or place, and dependeth not on the imagination, but is a real part of that we call the universe. For the universe, being the aggregate of all bodies, there is no real part thereof that is not also body, nor anything properly a body, that is not also part of that aggregate of all bodies, the universe. From this standpoint, Hobbes went on to develop some theories about the nature of knowledge and thought, or reasoning. All knowledge must relate to the properties and motions of bodies, derived from what we can team about them through the medium of the senses. Thought is impossible without a body that has sensations, and it consists in a train of ideas derived from sense impressions. But the train of ideas itself is nothing but a process of the stringing together of words. We attach different words to bodies and to the various motions of bodies, according as we have become aware of them by sensation, and so by joining words together we affirm or deny facts concerning the bodies that surround us. Reason, said Hobbes, is nothing but the reckoning of the consequences of general names agreed upon. It follows from this that various kinds of error are possible. There are errors in fact, errors in reckoning, and also absurdities to which philosophers are peculiarly prone. Seeing that truth consisteth in the right ordering of names in our affirmations, Hobbes wrote, a man that seeketh precise truth had need to remember what every name he uses stands for, and to place it accordingly, or else he will find himself entangled in words, as a bird in lime twigs. ch1, 4. General words, that is, those which do not, like proper names, stand for particular bodies, but signify properties or relations of bodies, must have their use and application defined in order that reckoning or reasoning may be performed with them. But when such words are used without definition, or when they are combined in ways repugnant with their definitions, the result is absurdity or senseless speech. And therefore, said Hobbes, if a man should talk to me of a round quadrangle I, or a material substance Z, a dree willy or any free but free from being hindered by opposition, I should not say that he were in an error, but that his words were without meaning, that is to say, absurd. Most philosophies, he concluded, consist of nothing but such absurdities, and indeed, any philosophy must always be senseless that deals with anything other than bodies, and the words we use for speaking of bodies and their various motions. Substance and body, he wrote, signify the same thing, and therefore substance and corporeal are words which when they are joined together destroy one another, as if a man should say an incorporeal body. These views about thought and reason, and about the absurdity of any but a strictly materialist philosophy, brought Hobbes, the successor of Bacon, into a very direct clash with Descartes. Hobbes ridiculed Descartes' interpretation of cogito ergo sum as implying the existence of an immaterial substance which thinks. That which thinks is corporeal, he objected. For since we cannot separate thought from a matter that thinks, the proper inference seems to be that that which thinks is material rather than immaterial. Furthermore, reasoning depends on names, names on the imagination, and imagination on the motion of the corporeal organs. Thus mind is nothing but the motion in certain parts of an organic body. Against Descartes' geometrical proofs derived from clear and distinct ideas about the nature or essences of things, Hobbes objected. Reason gives us no conclusion about the nature of things, but only about the terms that designate them. Essence as distinguished from existence is nothing else but a union of names by means of the verb is, and thus essence without existence is a fiction of our mind. The very curt and indignant replies which Descartes addressed to Hobbes indicated clearly enough his abhorrence of Hobbes' evident atheism and of the whole tendency of his conclusions. See Descartes, objections urged by certain men of learning against the preceding meditations, with the author's replies. The third set of objections, with the author's reply. 4. The object of knowledge. Was there a middle path between Hobbes' uncompromising materialism and Descartes' deductive method? Did Bacon's conception of man the interpreter of nature have to lead to Hobbes' conclusions? This path was discovered by John Locke, the philosopher of the glorious bourgeois revolution of 1688 and the father of British empiricism. Locke began his essay concerning the human understanding with an onslaught against innate ideas, the doctrine that certain ideas, such as God, substance, cause, etc., are innate in the human mind, not derived from experiential sources, and self-evidently true. Thus he began with an implied attack on Descartes in justification of Bacon and Hobbes. As against the doctrine of innate ideas, he tried to show in elaborate detail how the whole of human knowledge is built up through the action of external material objects on the bodily sensory organs. Let us suppose, Locke wrote, the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? To this I answer in one word: from experience. Our observation employed either about external sensible objects, or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected upon by ourselves, is that which supplies our understanding with all the materials of thinking. These two are the fountains of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have, or can naturally have, do spring. Essay 2, I, 2. According to Locke, the action of external objects upon our sense organs produces, in the first place, simple ideas, the elementary sense data supplied by each of the senses. These simple ideas are the atoms, so to speak, from which the whole complex of our thoughts is built. They form the materials of all our knowledge. When the understanding is once stored with these simple ideas, Locke maintained, it has the power to repeat, compare and unite them, and so can make it pleasure new complex ideas. But it is not in the power of the most exalted wit, or enlarged understanding, to invent or frame one new simple idea in the mind. Locke then distinguished simple ideas which, as he asserted, were exact resemblances of qualities inhering in the bodies which evoked them, and simple ideas which nothing in the external world resembled. The former he called ideas of primary qualities, the latter ideas of secondary qualities. Thus our ideas of solidity, extension, figure, motion or rest, and number, were ideas of primary qualities, corresponding exactly to the real solidity, extension, figure, motion or rest, and number, of the objects of the material world. But our ideas of color, taste, smell, sound were ideas of secondary qualities only, not corresponding to any real color, taste, smell or sound inhering in material objects. The ideas of primary qualities of bodies, Locke wrote, are resemblances of them, and their patterns do really exist in the bodies themselves, but the ideas produced in us by these secondary qualities have no resemblances to them at all. There is nothing like our ideas existing in the bodies themselves. They are in the bodies we denominate by them, only a power to produce those sensations in us, and what is sweet, blue, warm an idea, is but the certain bulk, figure, and motion, of the insensible parts in the bodies themselves, which we call so. In this theorizing about ideas, Locke made an assumption which proved of the greatest importance for his successors, inasmuch as none of them ever questioned it until recently. Namely, he maintained that when we perceive, think, understand, judge, know, in other words, when we carry out any act of cognition from the simplest sort of sense perception to the most complicated or abstract thought, then the objects of our cognition are not external material objects themselves, but are rather our own ideas which are called up in our minds by the action of external objects. This assumption is made in his initial definition of the term idea, which he defined as that term which, ithmk, serves best to stand for whatsoever is the object of understanding when a man thinks. In dealing with the development of knowledge, Locke proceeded to say, since the mind, in all its thoughts and reasonings, hath no other immediate object but its own ideas, which it alone does or can contemplate, it is evident that our knowledge is only conversant about them. Knowledge, then, seems to me to be nothing but the perception of the connection and agreement, or disagreement and repugnancy, of any of our ideas. In this alone it consists. The perceptions, thoughts and knowledge of man, therefore, are confined within the circle of his own ideas. It is ideas, not things, that we contemplate or are conversant about. In order to grasp what Locke was saying, we should note that he was using the word idea in an extended sense, wider than that in which the word is generally used. For him, idea included sensation and perception. When we perceive something, then, according to Locke, the action of that thing on our sense organs has evoked an idea, which is the object we are sensibly aware of. If afterwards we think about that thing in circumstances when we are not actually perceiving it, then the object of our thought, still called the idea, is a kind of replica or image of the original idea which was implanted upon the senses. Whether we are perceiving things or only thinking about them, the object of our cognition is always the idea, whether this be the actual sense datum, as in the case of perception, or its replica, as in the case of thought 5. The appearance becomes the object. If one compares Hobbes' earlier account of perception and thought with the alleged improvement made upon I by Locke, it is doubtful whether the latter was really an improvement at all. According to Hobbes, when we perceive something there occurs a seeming or apparition of it. These words do not, for him, denote the objects of perception, but are used in the description or statement of the process in which a sensitive organism interacts with other bodies, those bodies being then the objects perceived. But Locke made the apparition or appearance into an object. It became, for him, the object and the only object of cognition. Again, according to Hobbes, to think is to use words. But according to Locke, when we think we are contemplating, combining and recombining the replicas or images of the alleged objects of perception. And, for him, these replicas, or ideas, are the objects of thought. Certainly, the texts cited from both these philosophers lack the definition of terms and precision of language very properly demanded by professional philosophers today. But Hobbes' account has the advantage of postulating nothing except the existence of human sensitive organisms which have acquired the use of language, whereas Locke postulates also the mind and all sorts of objects which exist solely in the mind, its own ideas, which it alone does or can contemplate, without offering any evidence at all for such postulates, or demonstrating any advantage to be gained from them. We shall see later that the rather acute analyses of questions connected with perception published by contemporary linguistic philosophers in effect demolish the assumption of X, O can lead to conclusions much more like those of Hobbes. Having announced that its own ideas are the objects of all the mind's thoughts and reasonings, Locke nevertheless concluded that human knowledge does relate to the objective material world, because ideas are caused by the action on us of external material objects and are copies of them. It is evident, he wrote, that mind knows not things immediately, but only by the intervention of the ideas it has of them. Our knowledge therefore is real only so far as there is conformity between our ideas and the reality of things. But this means that our knowledge of things is necessarily very limited. Thus, because we can be conversant only with our ideas of bodies, and not with the bodies themselves, therefore I am apt to doubt that how far soever human industry may advance useful and experimental philosophy in physical things, scientifical will still be out of our reach, because we want perfect and adequate ideas of those very bodies which are nearest to us, and most under our command. In particular, we must remain forever ignorant of the substance of things. According to Locke, when we repeatedly find a group of simple ideas associated together, then we accustom ourselves to suppose some substratum wherein they do subsist, and from which they do result, which therefore we call substance. 2:23 period. But what the nature of this substance is, our ideas do not inform us. They only indicate to us that substances exist, which are the ultimate cause of our ideas. The secret, abstract nature of substance is ignavra. The idea of corporal substance or matter is as remote from our conceptions and apprehensions as that of spiritual substance or spirit. Thus with Locke a position was reached, which he derived from the original Baconian principle that all knowledge is based on experience, according to which the object of our knowledge is not the objective world, but the subjective world of our own ideas. The scope of knowledge is limited to the perception of the order and arrangement, agreement and disagreement, of our own ideas. Behind our ideas, so to speak, and causing them is the objective world. But of the nature of the objects which constitute this world we can know nothing. They are, to use a phrase coined 100 years after Locke, unknowable things in themselves. Thus both Hobbes' assurance of the materiality of the universe, and Descartes' assurance of the existence of distinct material and spiritual substances, alike vanish. At the same time, and certainly inconsistently, Locke maintained that, to a certain extent, our ideas are true copies of real things, and that to that extent we do know what things in themselves are like, namely, our ideas of solidity, extension, figure, motion and number are true copies of the real solidity, extension, figure, motion and number of objective things. How did Locke's theory come to involve such inconsistencies? It happened because he turned certain distinctions into hard oppositions, which it would nevertheless be difficult to justify by any appeal to experience. He opposed the sensation or idea produced in the mind to the external object, on the one hand, and to the act of cognition, on the other hand, so that, for him, ideas existed as a set of sensible or mental objects standing between N and D and the objective world. He opposed the substance of a thing to the totality of its properties, so that while the properties might be known, the substance remained as the unknown support of such properties. The substance or being was abstracted in on the thing's becoming, and set up as a separate and unknowable entity distinct from the totality of happenings, relationships and properties. and he opposed theory to practice, knowing to doing, so that it appeared that while a man might in his practical life be engaged with material things, in his theoretical activity he was not engaged with them at all, but with his own ideas. It was from such abstract oppositions that the difficulties and inconsistencies arose. 6. The social contract. It was by no accident that the kind of discussion engaged in by Hobbes and Locke, about the sources and objects of knowledge, was started in 17th century England. The early rise of capitalism, and the breakup of every form of feudal institution and ideology, through the growth of capitalist relationships within the old system, caused these problems to be posed. Old scholastic ways of thinking had to be overcome if the spirit of science, invention and discovery, so necessary for the development of capital, was to hold sway. Such developments as navigation, mining, and the use of artillery in warfare were demanding the aid of scientific research, and the new philosophy sought, above all, to explain and justify the methods of the natural sciences. But it also sought to show how new, scientific methods of thought could be extended beyond the phenomena of nature to the comprehension of human relations, and, in particular, to the comprehension of government, what government is and how it should best be conducted. It was natural enough that questions about government should have loomed large, since at that time the right of the old rulers to rule was being called in question and efforts were being made to establish forms of representative government. Hobbes and Locke both considered that their new philosophy completely refuted the old idea that government rested on divine decree. Where was the evidence for such a view? It had been put forward and believed on no basis of evidence whatsoever. They considered, on the contrary, that an empirical examination of the actual circumstances of human social life would show up both the origins and functions of government. Hobbes' Leviathan was concerned with that great Leviathan called a commonwealth, or state. The natural condition of mankind, he considered, is one of war of all against all, in which each would try to get what he could at the expense of all the rest, and in which human life would be in consequence solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. The only way of avoiding the inconveniences of this state of nature is for men to enter into a compact with one another to confer all their power and strength upon one man, or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills, by plurality of voices, unto one will, thus constituting an authority, or mortal God, which hath the use of so much power and strength conferred on him, that by terror thereof, he is enabled to form the wills of them all, to peace at home, and mutual aid against their enemies abroad. Once such an authority is set up, people have to obey it, simply because it has the material power to force them to, for covenants, without the sword, are but words, and if it weakens and loses its terror, then its subjects cannot but relapse into the miseries of the state of nature. Hobbes had no doubt at all that government rests on the exercise of physical force, but he also stressed that various other means are brought into play to subdue the governed, and notably the teachings of religion. This view of the functions of religion was not, with him, an argument for the abolition of religion. Very much to the contrary, it was an argument to show that, although religion rests on no evidence, it is politically necessary to uphold it. Hobbes was careful to point out that this theory of government was not put forward as an historical one. He did not maintain that in any historical period everyone had lived in condition of war, nor that on any historical occasion they had actually entered into a compact to end it. What he did maintain was that, without government, such would be people's condition, that the origin of government is the need to avoid such a condition, and that the function of government is to secure people against it. Leviathan was published in 1651, 3 years after the execution of Charles I, and found favor with no one. It was obviously unacceptable to the defeated royalists, and the parliamentary army wanted to claim some other foundation than naked force as the justification of the Commonwealth. Parliament condemned it office Italy in 1666. Hobbes, who had been nonpartisan during the Civil II wars, and had lived in retirement overseas, afterwards found favor at the court of Charles II, though probably more because he was good company in Parliament had condemned his book, than for any more politic reason. Locke's essay concerning the true original, extent and end of civil government, the second of his 2 treatises of government, the first of which contained an elaborate refutation of the doctrine of divine right of kings, came in 1690, and was in effect a theoretical justification of the settlement made by the glorious revolution of 1688. Locke started from the same premise as Hobbes, that government has no divine sanction, but arises simply because men could not maintain their social intercourse without it. But when it came to the actual origins and functions of government, he took another stand. According to Locke, government originates from property, and its function is to preserve and protect property. He did not accept Hobbes' idea of man in a state of nature being a kind of wild beast. He considered that men were naturally industrious, and had to be so, in order to live while property originated naturally from the claims which men make on the products of their own labors. And to protect property, government became necessary. Submission to government represented, as Hobbes had stated, a kind of compact. But this compact was made for the sake of protecting the products of men's labors, or preserving property. And that, according to Locke, was the same thing as preserving liberty, namely, each man's liberty to dispose and order freely as he lists his person, actions, possessions, and his whole property, and therein not to be subject to the arbitrary will of another. 6. Locke considered that the property of improving landowners, merchants and manufacturers, unlike that of bad feudal barons, which was got by pillage, was theirs by virtue of their industry. The great and chief aim of men uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government, he wrote, is the preservation of their property. 9. The power of government is limited to the public good of society. It is a power that hath no other end but preservation, and therefore can never have a right to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish the subjects. It cannot assume to itself a power to rule by extemporary arbitrary decree. The supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent, and therefore there remains still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative, when they the legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in them. According to Locke, to acquire property is natural to men, and therefore the right to property is a natural, inborn or inherent right of human beings. Governments, instituted to protect and preserve property, are therefore the guardians of the rights of man, and are well or ill constituted and conducted to the extent that they fulfill this obligation. 7. Appearance and reality, with his insistence on the role played by social production and by property, Locke was certainly far more realistic and less doctrinaire than Hobbes, with his myth of the state of nature. At the same time, Locke did succeed in obscuring the central and key fact which emerged in the theory of Hobbes, that far from men possessing inborn inalienable rights, all rights, like covenants, are but words save in so far as they can be enforced, and that governments or states represent an organization of physical force and coercion employed for compelling people, by terror, to act in one way rather than another. Convinced of this central fact, Hobbes asked why such an organization should have come into being, and he answered that the only reason could be that without it human existence would be impossible, since in that case the conflicts between people would rage unchecked. This idea that the state came into existence to moderate human conflicts reappeared 200 years later in the political philosophy of Marx and Engels. In their case it was based, however, on an analysis of the actual development of historical class struggles, which resulted from the improvement of primitive forces of production, division of labor and the emergence of private property. In order that class antagonisms should not consume society, a power apparently standing above society became necessary to moderate the conflict, wrote Engels. Marx and Engels likewise showed that the rights men claim are expressions of class interests, and that the struggle for the enforcement of claimed rights is the struggle of one class against another. But unlike the later materialist theory of Marx and Engels, Hobbes' theory of the state was not historical, and it included no conception of the historical development of state power. Hobbes maintained that men are individually so constituted by nature that each must always seek only his own satisfaction, so that all must always be at each other's throats, unless some armed authority exists to control them. Men must therefore always be subject to a state, which must always assume some more or less tyrannical and arbitrary form. Marx and Engels, on the other hand, seeing the state as the product of class struggles, were able to show that it generally functions as an organ of class rule and that, with the eventual disappearance of class antagonisms in communist society, the state, as an organization of coercion, must eventually wither away. The society which organizes production on the basis of free and equal association of the producers, wrote Engels, will put the whole state machinery where it will then belong, into the Museum of Antiquities. Next, the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. Ibid. Hobbes' conception of human nature, with each man the natural enemy of every other, was almost a caricature of bourgeois individualism. He was undoubtedly a bourgeois thinker, but his peculiarity was that he insisted on carrying things to their logical conclusions in a way that was unacceptable to the bourgeoisie of his own or any subsequent date. For this reason he was, and has remained, the odd man out of bourgeois philosophy. He carried Bacon's conception of man the interpreter of nature to its logical conclusion in atheistical materialism, and he carried the refutation of the idea of the divine sanction of government to its logical conclusion in the doctrine that the authority of the state rests on its possessing the material means of coercion. Locke, on the other hand, was a thinker who well succeeded in formulating the ideas of the progressive bourgeoisie of his time, in such a way as to define and justify the system of liberties in which that class was able to rule. His theories, which soon assumed a rather conservative tone in Britain, were, when exported to America and, later, to France, highly revolutionary. He insisted that good government must be placed on a representative basis, and he urged the adoption of that system of constitutional checks and balances which was, at the time, intended, and did actually serve, as a guarantee against despotism, but which later came to serve so well as the means whereby men of property could obstruct legislation which might not be in their interests. But in pulling off these not mean achievements, Locke's theory of government did, at the same time, disguise the reality of the state. The state existed, according to this theory, for the public good of society, namely, the preservation of property, and property, entitlement to which was founded on each man's honest productive labors, was sacrosanct and inviolable. So far, therefore, from being an organ of coercion, the state was the effective guarantee of each man's liberty in the enjoyment and use of his property. Propounded at the time of the primitive accumulation of capital, when fortunes were being made from the slave trade and overseas plunder, when landowners were enriching themselves by improving estates got by enclosing common lands, and when a few grandees were directing everything while the majority of people touched their forelocks, this theory of the state was a staggering example of deception and humbug. However sincere Locke may have been, and however brightly the flame of liberty burned in his breast, thanks to the analysis made by Marx, it is now a well-known fact of capitalist society that appearances belie reality. The employment of wage labor looks like a fair contract between employer and employed. In reality, it is the means by which the former gets the product of the unpaid labor of the latter. The laws look as though they protect everyone's right to the use of his own property. In reality, they protect the right of a few to own all the means of production while the majority have no property apart from personal belongings, and those they may forfeit if they are unlucky enough to fall out of work. The state looks like an organization representing everyone and acting for the public good. In reality, it represents the interests of the capitalist class and acts on behalf of that class. The link between Locke's essay concerning the human understanding and essay concerning civil government, his theory of ideas, and his theory of government, his general philosophy and his political philosophy, lies precisely in this, that in the former, he maintained that knowledge has for its object only the appearances of things presented to us and the ideas formed of them in our minds, while in the latter he treated only of the appearances which the bourgeois state presents in the minds of the progressive bourgeoisie. 8. The bourgeois dilemma. In the contrast between the theories of Hobbes and Locke, there appeared for the first time that dilemma which has troubled bourgeois philosophy ever since: how to follow the paths of science without abandoning bourgeois illusions. The great intellectual and social impact of the writings of Hobbes did not consist in their founding any new school of thought, still less in their serving any political or class interests, revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. There have never been any Hobbes or Hobbesites. Hobbes' power lay in repulsion rather than attraction. His writings served as a warning, a red light signaling danger ahead. The promotion of the sciences is part of the very lifeblood of the bourgeois social order. The dilemma presented to all bourgeois thinkers consists of this: that either you take your stand by the sciences and sacrifice your illusions, or else you take your stand by your illusions and sacrifice the sciences. But they are prepared to do neither the one thing nor the other, and so some third way has to be found. The method proposed by Descartes, of constructing a philosophy standing above the sciences but not contradicting them, by means of deductions from allegedly self-evident axioms or first principles, represented one attempt at finding the way, though Descartes himself, due to the conditions under which he had to work, seemed more concerned with avoiding being condemned by the Catholic Church than with squaring the sciences with more properly bourgeois ideas. And in the centuries since, a variety of such superscientific philosophies have been proposed. It may be remarked, incidentally, that the so-called deductive system, often supposed to be the typical scholastic or feudal mode of philosophy, is in fact a bourgeois product. It was invented by Descartes. Such philosophies, however, have always been vulnerable. The more the sciences have advanced, the less plausible have such philosophies become, for their first principles are never self-evident, their deductions always contain fallacies, and their conclusions are always found to contradict later scientific discoveries. The most fruitful, the most plausible, and at once the simplest and most flexible way was that discovered by Locke. This interpretation of Locke is confirmed by what he himself put on record about the origins and motives of his philosophy. In 1670, when he was confidential secretary to Lord Ashley, subsequently Lord Shaftesbury, Chancellor under Charles II, he used, as he relates, to meet regularly with a few friends to discuss the principles of morality and religion. But they found themselves quickly at a stand by the difficulties that arose on every side. In other words, they found those principles hard to justify by current conceptions of scientific analysis. It seemed to him then that before reaching any conclusions they ought first to inquire more deeply into the processes of reasoning and understanding themselves. Before we set ourselves upon inquiries of that nature, it was necessary to examine our own abilities, and see what objects our understandings were or were not fitted to deal with. This examination occupied him for the next 20 years, and its final results were published in his essay concerning human understanding. The essence of Locke's approach was to find how understanding could be extended by first examining its limitations, and he laid it down that the human understanding is fitted to deal with no more than the ideas, impressions or appearances of things implanted in the mind. With these alone we are conversant, and no science can ever make us conversant with anything else. The scientific approach, whether in the natural sciences or in matters of morality and government, must always be content to argue about things only as they affect us, its object being not the things but the ideas of them in our minds. Locke thus limited the sphere of possible scientific inquiry, and denied that it could penetrate to the substance of things. To try to do that meant pushing inquiry beyond our capacities, and could only result in difficulty and error. This way of ideas has, as we shall see, been persistently explored from the time of Locke right up to the present day. Its virtue is that it enables the explorers at one and the same time to accept the empirical approach and the discoveries of the natural sciences, and to reject all materialism such as that of Hobbes or, more to the point later, of Marx, and keep the discussion of social and moral problems on a plane where the real contradictions and motive forces operating in society, behind the facade of social consciousness, remain hidden and are never allowed to intrude. Chapter 2, Skepticism and Conservatism.